Good morning, everyone. How's it going? Hope you're having a good day. Time to continue to discuss the defensive coordinator situation in Seattle. I've let the topic lay for a couple of days here. Not a whole lot has been going on. We're not hearing a whole lot new from the organization. And by the way, it may continue to go on for a few weeks here. There's no hurry on hiring this guy unless you're going after a guy who's a super hot prospect that everybody's going to want, which doesn't seem to be the case with us. We're not going after the Vic Fangio. We're not going after the Brian Flores or the Dan Quinn. I mean, those last two guys probably going to be head coaches, but regardless, we're not going after the guys who are going to immediately draw a ton of attention. Mike Zimmer. The guys that we have targeted so far, I'm not too worried about another team swooping in and poaching them. So it could be a little while before we find out what we're doing at defensive coordinator. Haven't really heard anything new from the team in a minute, but I do want to go back and revisit something that was said about a week ago. I talked about this a little bit already, but I want to talk about what it might mean and what it might really look like if this happened. So, about a week ago, Jake Heaps had a theory as to what the Seattle Seahawks might be doing at the defensive coordinator spot after letting Ken Norton Jr. go. He talked about it on, I think it was 710, and one thing that he said that was pretty interesting was he is getting more and more convinced that you're going to see a co-defensive coordinator situation here in Seattle. And then he goes on to specify what he thinks will actually happen in terms of the guys who get hired. It would be with defensive line coach Clint Hurt taking over the run game coordinator responsibilities and Ed Donatell taking over as the passing game coordinator and really focusing on the secondary and pass coverage. Hurt and Donatell coached together for 2 years in Chicago under Vic Fangio, so they have a little bit of history together as well. And in theory, this kind of makes sense. But you don't see that many tandem coordinators in the NFL. You see them a little bit more in college. This article even touches on how the University of Washington did it with Jimmy Lake and Pete Kwiatkowski on their defense for a little while, where they didn't have one dedicated defensive coordinator. But you usually don't see it in the NFL. You don't never see it, of course. You've seen it before. This isn't unprecedented. But it is nevertheless interesting. It's not something you would have necessarily expected. And if this ends up coming to pass, I'm wondering what it might look like and what the advantages and disadvantages might be. So it seems to me that the Seattle Seahawks really like Clint Hurt. They really like him, and they don't want to lose him. But they know they may lose him because he may take that Miami Hurricanes defensive coordinator job. If that would be a promotion, that would be a step up for him in his career. He would possibly take that. So they don't want to lose him, and the only way to guarantee you don't lose him is to give him the defensive coordinator job, because then he would be choosing between a pro job and a college job, and he would probably choose to stay in the NFL because most people aspire to that if they're going to be coaches. However, they maybe feel like he's not ready. They feel like he's good. They feel like he's good at what he does. They feel like he has potential, but they don't think he's ready yet. So they're trying to find a way to keep him, but not make him the guy on the defensive coordinator side. So they're going to let him take over as just the running game defensive coordinator, basically, and then bring in somebody else to take over the passing game coordinator job. Theoretically, that does make a decent amount of sense. Clint Hurt has been coaching the defensive line for the last few years in Seattle, and against the run, the team has been really good. We have multiple guys on that defensive line who are very good at stopping the run. Poona Ford, Al Woods, Kerry Hyder. Those guys are run stuffers first and foremost, and sometimes having them out there is a detriment to our pass rush. But our run defense has been really good for most of Clint Hurt's time here. The last 2 years, I can probably count on one hand the number of games where the run defense actually played bad. So keeping Clint Hurt in that capacity does make sense. And then you bring in somebody from the outside to address the pass defense, which has been a clear weakness over the last, I would say, I guess, 3 years. So you're bringing in Donatell, who hasn't touched this defense yet, who has no real, he had nothing to do with the defense over the last 3 years, and you're saying, okay, let's fix this passing game defense. So that part of it does make sense. But what I'm trying to figure out here is who's going to really be in charge here and who's really going to be calling the plays. And we won't know for sure unless this happens, and then we see it once the season starts. However, what makes sense to me is that you have Hurt as the run game coordinator on defense, and then you have Ed Donatel as the passing game coordinator on defense. But at that point, is Pete Carroll going to be the defensive play caller? There are some head coaches who do play calling duties in the NFL. Pete is the defensive guy. The play calling under Norton was suspect, so would Pete take control of the play calling then? If it's not Pete, it seems to me that it would be Donatel. And by the way, Ed Donatel being the guy who comes in as the passing game coordinator is not necessarily a lock. You could have Clint Hurt working with Desai. I know some people really like Desai. I like him too. Could be Joe Witt Jr. You could bring in those guys to be the passing game defense coordinators instead of Donatel. That's also certainly on the table, but it seems to me that the guy with 30-plus years of experience in the NFL, like Ed Donatel, would likely get the play-calling nod and kind of be the guy in charge of the overall defense, because you don't want a situation where both guys kind of have an equal amount of power and nobody's in charge, right? You want somebody who can say, I'm in charge here, we're going to do this. Obviously, I value your input. I value what you can do. I like you. But one of those two guys would need to be in charge, or somebody else would have to be the guy in charge. I don't think you can just have two guys both saying that they're on an equal footing, and if they disagree with something, they're just going to fight it out until one of them gives up, basically. So I would assume that the veteran that you bring in to be the passing game coordinator would be that guy, but really, I think it would probably be Carroll, and I think Carroll would probably be taking over play calling, which would be really interesting. And I have mixed feelings about that. There are definitely some issues with having your head coach be a play caller as well. You've seen some instances with head coaches in the NFL who do play calling. I know Mike Holmgren talked about this. I remember it happened to Jason Garrett when he was in Dallas. They were calling plays, and they were the head coach. And there were times when they were getting pulled in two different directions. The head coach part of them wanted to go argue with an official, and the offensive coordinator side wanted to make them go call the next play. And they wouldn't have time to get into it with the officials because they needed to get the next play call in. They wouldn't have time to do the head coaching stuff because the next play call needed to get in. So hopefully, if Carroll really would take control of the play calling in this situation, that wouldn't be a big issue. And also, with you having Pete Carroll doing the defensive play calling, that means you're kind of locking yourself into it being the purest form of the Pete Carroll defense. You're not going to bring in anything exotic. You're not going to do anything that differently. It's going to be somewhat different than it was with Norton or even Quinn or Bradley or Richard, but it is going to be that Pete Carroll defense in maybe its purest form yet, and it's a kind of defense that you could really argue other offenses across the NFL have already started to kind of figure out, already have a pretty good feel of how to beat. I'm not crazy about it. But what I will say is that it gives Pete an opportunity to really be the guy who controls everything on that side of the ball. He won't have any excuses. He won't be able to say anything at the end of the year if it doesn't work out. It will be his defense in totality. It will be his players that he brought in as the de facto GM. It will be his game plans and player development that he does during the week, during the offseason, training camp, preseason. And it will be his in-game adjustments and play calling during the game. It'll all be Pete. And there are definitely problems with that. Like, for instance, I don't think Jamal Adams is best suited to play in the pure Pete Carroll defense. I think that Jamal Adams would do better in more of exotic blitz-type defense that you saw in Miami with Brian Flores. But That being said, Pete was the guy who traded a whole bunch of stuff to get Jamal Adams in here. So now he has to completely live with that decision. Where if he gets to be the play caller and he still can't get all pro level play out of Jamal Adams, then you can really say, what in the world were you doing when you traded everything for him? You traded quarterback type capital for Jamal Adams, and even when you have complete control over every step of the process, you can't get the most out of him. So it takes away the excuse that he could make. It takes away any ability that he has to say, no, 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 go blame this guy. It's not my fault. It's Norton's fault, I promise. We're going to get Norton out of here and everything's going to be okay again. If he becomes the play caller, there will be none of that. Now, honestly, regardless of who the play caller is in 2022 for the Seahawks defense, that should probably be the case anyway, because at this point, it's Carroll already got to scapegoat one defensive play caller. We should not allow him to have another, because he's hiring these guys at the end of the day. He's hiring the Ken Nortons. He's hiring the Brian Schottenheimers. But if you let him take control of the play calling, you will get a purely Pete Carroll defense. And if it does not work, if it does not win, if it does not succeed, then there is nowhere for him to run. He controls this defense at every level. But the whole idea of a joint co-defensive coordinator situation, I do like the idea of having more perspectives. I do like the idea of having more experience. I do like this idea of building a big, robust, multifaceted, talented, experienced group of coaches, because there's no salary cap on coaches. You can do whatever you want to there. You can spend all the money you want to. I do like that, but what do you guys think? Do you think this could work? What would you think about a joint defensive coordinator position, basically, in 2022? See you guys later. Go Hawks.